Constitution. You're including me here. So I'm not sure that this is constitutional as it stands. Her second concern about the diversion agreement is that there's a provision that says if there's a breach or no breach, he's shielded from other prosecution in the future, and that relates to tax crimes. So her concern was, why do we have this tax element mixed in with the gun charge? So concerns it was unconstitutional and this kind of commingling of the statutes and the agreement. But the bottom line is that she is deferring. She's not accepting or rejecting. She's asked both of the parties to provide her with additional information. And for now, the president's son has pleaded not guilty to those charges.
Major, major developments there. Catherine Herridge, you've been in the courtroom and bringing us all the updates. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We want to bring in now CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, both the prosecutors and the defense had tried to hammer together a deal. We just heard from Catherine some of the reasons why the judge rejected it. She went into greater detail about the gun charge. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about these tax crimes.
Absolutely. Well, they basically center on failure to pay taxes. And I think that sounds like it will be and I'm loath to use the word easy, but the easiest part of this, in the sense that I think what the judge wanted to do overall today is push pause. 3 hours is a very long time for this type of hearing. 2 different recesses is fairly unusual. And so if in fact, both sides do come back together, and if, in fact, there is a plea deal, I think the most likely situation is that there would be a plea deal, at least on the tax charges. Again, because even though none of this, as we've seen from the last few hours, is straightforward, that is the most straightforward. Now, I think when it comes to the gun charges, as Catherine laid out very quickly, there are 2 questions in the judge's mind. One, why are they basically looped in with the tax charges here? And 2, will it go into effect in the right way? If there is, in fact, a violation of the terms, will the right body be the one to make that determination, either a judge or the prosecutors? And so I think that this judge is going to take a look and see what she thinks is the most appropriate, legally speaking. I don't expect that any future plea deal in the short term would include those potential charges relating to foreign lobbying. I think that sounds to me like it's the trickiest part of this, the fact that this has been a 5-year investigation, and the attorney who, again, was appointed by former President Trump has said that investigation is ongoing. If it's ongoing after 5 years, that indicates to me that that is the trickiest part of this.
And how soon might the next step take place? Is this done for today? I'm wondering.
It sounds like this is done for today, and it makes all the sense in the world that if there is a deferral, which it sounds like there is on the plea deal, that Hunter Biden would plead not guilty, because if he pleads guilty, then we're in an entirely different situation. He's in an entirely different negotiation posture. And so he's not going to plead guilty until he knows what type of deal is on the table. So that part, again, I'm loath to use words like typical, but that part makes all the sense in the world, that he would say, okay, then not guilty. And that really is kind of not guilty, comma, for right now, until I know what type of deal might be on the table later. So are we done for today? The reporting indicates, and I would defer to Catherine because she's on the ground, but the reporting indicates that yes, we are. And federal judges, as we've talked about from other high-profile cases, are very much in charge of their own schedules. Excuse me.
Sorry, we need to interrupt you at this point. We understand that we are going to have a special report. So we appreciate all of the insight that you've been providing, and we are, of course, going to follow this throughout the day.
It also leads to better decision-making.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. We come on the air with breaking news. After several dramatic and unexpected hours of high courtroom drama, today the plea deal agreement between Hunter Biden and the Department of Justice has just fallen apart. Hunter Biden, the son of President Joe Biden, came to court this morning expecting to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor tax charges and was planning to enter into a pretrial diversion agreement on a felony gun possession charge. But in the end, there was no deal. It all collapsed. The judge presiding over the matter said this case needed more information before the judge would accept this proposed agreement. All of this follows a 5-year federal investigation led by U.S. Attorney for Delaware David Weiss. Now, before all this happened, Republicans had blasted this potential deal as merely a slap on the wrist and had accused the Department of Justice of interfering in this investigation. Meanwhile, 2 IRS whistleblowers also accused the Department of Justice of slow-walking parts of this investigation. U.S. Attorney Weiss, who we should note was nominated by then-President Donald Trump in 2017, has denied allegations of political interference. Now, Hunter Biden, when this was all set in motion earlier today, was expected to address reporters. After all this, we no longer know if that's going to happen. What we do know for sure is senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge, who was in the courtroom, joins us now from Wilmington, Delaware. Catherine, tell us what happened. Explain the change of arc of this story and Hunter Biden's demeanor throughout.
Well, Major, good to be with you. The 3-hour hearing in the courthouse behind me was extremely dramatic and tense. I was sitting for the most part of the hearing about 20 feet behind the president's son, and you could see in my view that he became increasingly anxious and somewhat agitated as it became clear that this plea agreement on the tax and the gun charge was in jeopardy. Just a few minutes ago, the federal judge Mary Ellen Noreika has told the court that she is deferring a decision on the plea agreement for the president's son. She said she cannot accept or reject it. She's asked the parties for additional information. She told them at one point, quote, "You are telling me just to rubber stamp this deal that is form over substance." She had serious concerns not only about the agreement on misdemeanor tax charges, but also on this diversion program for the felony gun offense. She said she believed there may be elements and provisions within that agreement that are unconstitutional in her view. She's given the parties 14 days to come back with filings to help clarify her questions, and she could reach a decision in about 30 days whether she will accept or reject this plea agreement. But this was an extraordinary scene that unfolded in the federal courthouse behind me, and just based on the demeanor of the president's son's legal team and Hunter Biden, one of a lot of disappointment, Major.
Catherine, help our audience work through this. It also strikes me that there was a fundamental misunderstanding in the presentation to the court of what this deal actually was. If I understand it correctly, Hunter Biden and his legal team thought that this deal, if sealed and approved by the federal judge, would end all things. It was global in reach, to use a term of art. But the prosecutor said no. The ongoing investigation continues, and that misunderstanding was sort of at the crux of one of the things the court was struggling to resolve. Is that about right?
Yeah, the simple explanation, Major, is that it does appear the two parties, Hunter Biden and his legal team and the U.S. Attorney in Delaware, for months have been talking past each other. From the perspective of the U.S. Attorney in Delaware, this remains an ongoing investigation, and based on what we heard in the court, Hunter Biden and his legal team felt that once this plea agreement was done, that his legal troubles were over. There was a sort of turning point in the hearing where the judge was asking about the ongoing investigation, and a member of the U.S. Attorney's team said, "I can't get into details." She asked, well, let's say, could there be a charge for a violation of foreign lobbying laws? The president's son did work with a Ukraine energy firm, a Chinese energy firm, a Romanian firm, among others, and he said that's possible. And that's when Hunter Biden's attorney says, we clearly don't have an agreement here. This is not our understanding. So talking past each other on this simple idea that a plea agreement was going to be the end of the legal story for Hunter Biden, and the U.S. attorney maintaining that it may not necessarily be so, Major.
I want to bring in Scott Frederickson, a former federal prosecutor, is with us today. Scott, this strikes me as something that would definitely fall into the category of highly unusual for the two parties to be talking to each other, but as Catherine said, past each other on such a central element as to whether or not this was an agreement to end all matters pertaining to Hunter Biden in the future or not, and then it all falls apart. Walk our audience through how very different a circumstance this actually is.
This kind of circumstance should never have happened. That's why it's so shocking. The plea agreement has fallen apart because of one key piece, and that is the defense thought that the plea agreement was a global resolution of all charges, all ongoing investigation of by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware. The government made clear when asked by the court that that was not the case, that this plea agreement does not resolve ongoing investigation. The fact is, that was an issue when the plea agreement was first announced. The government, the DOJ, said the investigation is ongoing, and the defense counsel said, we understand this wraps it all up. How this could have gotten to this point with that fundamental misunderstanding is shocking. That just doesn't happen in federal court. There's a second alternative, and that is defense thought that they might be able to get this kind of plea through with an understanding on the record that it resolved everything and they could go on their way. That clearly was not going to happen today. It broke down under that fundamental piece of misunderstanding.
Joining us now is legal expert and analyst Ricky Kleeman. Ricky, there's been a lot of conversation, debate is a fair word, about whether or not this plea deal as presented represented some kind of special treatment or something that was available to Hunter Biden because of his status as the president's son, meaning lighter treatment than somebody else. Your thoughts on that and where you see this case, after all this extraordinary developments today, heading?
Well, extraordinary is the word for today, but also for the misunderstanding that led to today. If this had, in fact, been a global plea deal, that is, by pleading guilty to 2 misdemeanor counts involving a failure to file tax returns for the years 2017 and 18, and a pretrial diversion on an application for a gun and denial of drug use, if somehow that had been a global deal, that Hunter Biden could not be prosecuted for anything else, particularly involving the questions of lobbying and not being a registered foreign lobbyist, then that would have been beyond special. That would have been beyond the pale. But I had never really understood this deal to be that global until we wound up in court today and saw that the prosecution didn't understand it to be that global either. So where is this going to go? Well, first of all, there is the matter of the simple resolution of the tax counts and the gun diversion. That's simple, that's clean, that can be done in and of itself. But are they going to continue to investigate? Well, if they weren't going to before today, clearly they are. And the they I am talking about is the prosecutor, the criminal justice system. We really thought that today was all about that and not about the politics, but it looks like the politics and the law collided.
And Ricky, very quickly, can Hunter Biden rescind that not guilty plea? Does that have a life of its own?
No, it doesn't have a life of its own. If you say you are not guilty, that happens at every arraignment throughout the land. But the problem that you've got now is what is to happen with today, and then what is to happen with the future.
No doubt. Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes is with us from the North Lawn. Nancy, this is an unexpected, and I would imagine for the White House, an uncomfortable turn of events. And I understand that it came up at today's briefing. What can you tell us?
It did come up just a few minutes ago, Major, and White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre's remarks were, as they usually are when it comes to Hunter Biden, pretty short and sweet. She basically said Hunter Biden is a private citizen, that this was a personal matter, that this was independently handled by the judiciary system and by a U.S. attorney that she pointed out was appointed by President Trump. This is something the White House likes to point out a lot. She said the president and the first lady support their son. And beyond that, she referred all questions about Hunter Biden to the Department of Justice, as she has, as U.S. officials have so many times before. The president and everyone on down here at the White House, whenever asked about Hunter Biden, sings the same refrain, which is that the president and the first lady love their son. They're proud of their son. They're proud of the fact that he is picking his life up and trying to pull it back together after a devastating bout of addiction to alcohol and other substances. But beyond that, they are quite tight-lipped. They say they don't ever want to look like they're trying to influence the judicial process.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. Thank you. I want to go back to Catherine Herridge, who, of course, is in Wilmington, Delaware. Catherine, you've been covering the story for a very long time. Talk to our audience about not only what happened there before your very eyes in Wilmington, but other matters that are going to come before the House Republicans related to Hunter Biden and how they may or may not intersect.
Well, one of the things that struck me, Major, from the outset of this hearing is that the federal judge, Mary Ellen Noreika, really set the tone almost out of the gate. She said that this diversion agreement on the felony gun charge, in her view, contained unusual and not standard terms. And I think that set the tone, set the table for the entire 3-hour proceeding. That was her line of questioning throughout. If there was a moment where I think it really started to turn, and I felt I could see that turn among the defense team and the president's son, it was when there was a brief sort of off-the-record discussion between the defense attorneys and members of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware. It's a very small courtroom, and you could pick up part of the conversation. And what I picked up is that a member of the U.S. Attorney's team said that's just not in the agreement. It's not an agreement to keep criminal charges off the table well into the future or forever. And Hunter Biden's attorney, Chris Clark, said, well, I guess maybe we just rip up the agreement, in effect. And to me, that was the moment that really severed this deal and paved the way for this decision by the judge to say that she needs more information and that she's going to defer on whether to accept or reject it at this point. The second part of your question, House Republicans have said that their investigations continue regardless of what was going to happen in Delaware today. I think one can make the argument that it now adds a little bit more fuel to the fire of those investigations. They had been hoping to hear from the U.S. attorney in Delaware under oath testimony at the end of September about his decision-making process. I think it's fair to assume that that now may be pushed off, depending on the resolution or non-resolution of this case in the next 30 days. Those investigations on Capitol Hill are extremely broad. I would sum it up by saying that they're not just simply looking at the business deals of Hunter Biden, they're looking at the family's involvement in these business deals. And the head of the House Oversight Committee, a Republican, has said that their investigation, in his words, have always been about Joe Biden. The White House position has been that these are tired, old allegations that have already been under scrutiny, and they do not find them credible in this case, Major.
Catherine Herridge in Wilmington, Delaware. Thank you. Once again, there is no federal plea deal in the Hunter Biden case. Our coverage on this story will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Good day.
All right, thanks for staying with us here on CBS News. I'm Errol Barnett.
And I'm Lana Zak. You've been watching a CBS News special report. The plea deal involving the president's son has fallen apart.
Now, he has now pleaded not guilty to 2 tax charges alone. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins us now. Jessica, what do you make of this deferral the judge is making when it comes to the weapons charge?
Well, I think it makes sense if she has more questions, which she clearly does. What she's saying is, I think, 2 things. One is why is the weapons charge kind of wrapped up in the tax charges the way they are? And the other is, I think she's really asking questions about the form of the settlement, meaning that the settlement is essentially that Hunter Biden can be subject to a diversion program. So there will be no charges based on this, it's sometimes called kind of drug addict in possession of a gun charge, if Hunter Biden can stay out of trouble, meaning can pass alcohol and drug tests and will not face any other criminal issues in those 2 years. There's some question by the judge about who would enforce that. And I think she believes that it should be the prosecution. The reporting indicates that, in fact, it would go to another judge as an initial matter. And I think she did what federal judges do, which is, I want additional briefing on this. At this point, again, to me, the most unusual thing is that, as Catherine Herridge discussed in the special report, there's this moment in the courtroom where everything appears to change, where the prosecution says, this is not a global settlement. This does not include every potential crime that Hunter Biden might have committed. And the defense says, then I'm ripping this up. I'm paraphrasing what Catherine said.
Right.
And that, to me, is the big story today, is that there had not, in fact, been a meeting of minds with respect to the prosecution and the defense and what they understood this plea deal to include. It's an entirely fair question from a federal judge to say, is this everything or is this limited?
So as I understand it, Jessica, both parties now have 14 days to brief, and the ruling might take weeks now. Though we thought it was all going to be settled today, it now is something that we're going to continue to assess for weeks to come. What are some of the risks and what are some of the advantages to both sides to actually being able to come up with a plea agreement?
So I think the plea agreement is useful to both sides just in general because it provides certainty and it saves resources. And for Hunter Biden, when it came to these particular charges here, when it came to the tax evasion charges and when it comes to the charges related to the gun possession, I think there was a lot of evidence, and maybe that's even an understatement, against him. And so to plead to misdemeanor and to save himself time in prison, that is a win. And for the prosecution to be able to save themselves the time and expense of a trial and the potential risk of a trial, there's always a risk there, that's also a win. I think the plea deal with respect to the tax charges and the drug charges really did make sense for both sides. As we've discussed throughout the morning, the bigger question is those potential charges related to foreign lobbying. And specifically, we're talking about whether or not Hunter Biden should have registered as a foreign lobbyist. Those are the more complicated charges. And that's where I think if the prosecution could come to a plea deal agreement, obviously, big hypotheticals here, but that could save them the risks of trying to go to trial on those fairly complicated issues, which indicate to me there are also complicated facts because the investigation has been going on for half of a decade now.
Really fascinating. Jessica Levinson, thank you so much and for your insight. As always, CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge joins us now after being in the courtroom and spending days and weeks covering this story. Catherine, I just want to get your reaction from being in the courtroom and watching what really seems unprecedented and quite shocking to us all.
Well, the simple explanation, Errol, is that what we saw unfold in the courthouse behind me is that the two parties, the defense team and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware, were not on the same page as to whether this agreement would close the door on any further legal problems for Hunter Biden. And there was a moment about halfway through where the judge said, let's take a recess, because it was clear that there was a lot of daylight between the parties. And there was sort of a side conference between a member of the U.S. Attorney's Office and Chris Clark, who's one of the lead defense attorneys for Hunter Biden. It's a relatively small courtroom, so we could hear part of that conversation. And you could hear them going back and forth with Clark saying, well, this is all negotiated. I don't understand what you're sort of trying to get at here. And a member of the U.S. Attorney's team said there was no agreement, which I took to mean like no sort of global agreement here. And Chris Clark says, maybe we just rip this whole thing up. And to me, that was the moment that the entire thing started unraveling. They went back at least once more, talking privately to see if they could salvage this agreement. They have made some modifications to the language in the agreement, but now this all has to be reviewed again by the judge in about 30 days. The judge has deferred. She doesn't have enough information, she says, to accept or reject the plea. That being said, the federal judge made very clear during the 3-hour hearing that she has serious concerns about this plea agreement. Not only this diversion program for the gun charge, she says, I have people who come into my court who essentially get jail time for this charge, and these sorts of programs are unusual for a gun charge. But then also she had some concerns about the tax misdemeanor charges, and just bear with me while I explain that, because I think that's one of the big editorial developments today.
Yeah.
So the misdemeanor was to failure to pay 2017 and 2018. Each year it was about $1.5 million in income. Now, these were years where Hunter Biden's drug addiction was well documented. This was part of the argument why he failed to pay his taxes, even though he had the money available to him. The key thing here is the timing, and the judge drilled down on this a couple of times, I think with real purpose for the record and for the transcript. Hunter Biden filed those back tax documents in 2019. And the reason that matters is that in 2019, he told the court he was clean and sober. Yet in 2019, he continued to make misrepresentations about what were personal and business deductions. We know from speaking to the IRS case agent who led the evidence gathering in this case that there were deductions, he said were business deductions, for escorts, for a sex club, for no-show employees. So it seemed important to me. The judge wanted to be clear that he did this at a time where he now says that he was sober, right? So that kind of takes the addiction element out of consideration.
Those details really eye-opening.
Yeah. I actually turned to Errol at one point and said, did she just say what I think she said? Yeah, all right. It's also interesting, you know, Catherine, since you brought up that point about the guns charge and the judge's questions about the diversion program, I've been researching it, and it's interesting that there's actually really good data about decreasing the recidivism rates, but that they are really applied, that they're rare, and that and that it just goes to the point that of this general question of, when you have individual judges, individual prosecutors, defense teams all making these agreements, that it isn't a universal blanket of justice that we apply, and that it very much depends on who is who's there and who is making the decisions. All right. Catherine Herridge, thank you.
We want to now bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane, gathering all the reaction on Capitol Hill. Scott, the obvious question would be, Republicans must be interpreting this as a bit of a political win for them.
They're saying in so many words, Errol, that this was a sweetheart deal that was proposed and that fell apart in the courtroom today, indicative of what they argue is a two-tiered system of justice. And they say if the judge face-to-face with Hunter Biden and face-to-face with the prosecutors today saw a red flag, there must have been a red flag in the deal that was cut between the U.S. Attorney of Delaware and Hunter Biden and Hunter Biden's defense team. This very much resonates with Republicans who've said this smelled fishy from the start. Now, we've seen plea agreements fall apart in court before. It's rare, but certainly not unheard of. It happens in federal courthouses and local courthouses on a daily or weekly basis. But often it's because the defendant and the judge are on a different page. You know, the judge is reading through a statement of facts, a proffer or an agreed upon set of facts, and the defendant takes some issue with some of it. When that happens, the judge calls off the plea agreement, says if you don't agree to these facts, you can't plead guilty today. This was quite different and a striking moment in the courthouse in Wilmington because the judge didn't like what either party came to the table with, didn't like the four corners of this agreement, and there also seemed to be a lack of communication in some way, shape, or form between the U.S. Attorney and the defense, which is itself rare, if not problematic, when they've come to the courthouse on the day of the plea agreement. Let's look at the bigger picture. And the politics are ripe on this right now for Republicans and House and Democrats here in the U.S. House and Senate. This case is now back on a trajectory toward trial. And the trial, by the normal pacing of the federal court system, seems destined for 2024 if no new plea agreement is reached, which means at the end of this day, we could have a Biden and a Trump on a pathway towards trial in 2024.
It is a lot to take in, particularly today with so much happening really on a minute-by-minute basis. Scott McFarland, as well as Catherine Herridge and Jessica Levinson, we thank you all. We're going to take a quick break right now.
Stay with us here on CBS News.
If it's important to our nation,
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
it's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, we're going to tell you about that, too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
the threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bringing virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battery lamps.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast, streaming on CBS News. An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether.
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
Apparently, hackers are looking to take advantage of the success of the Barbie movie.
Oh, the cybersecurity company McAfee says it is seeing a surge in malware attacks related to the film. The company warned in a blog post that scams including phony free ticket promotions and downloads of the film are all fake. They urge people to ignore the links on emails or texts that may seem suspicious. More than 1/3 of the viruses have targeted users in the U.S., and experts say make sure you buy tickets from official retailers and theaters so you do not fall prey.
Always good advice.
Hollywood and Broadway collided last night.
Yeah, stars from the Back to the Future film franchise attended a gala performance of Back to the Future, the musical, here in New York City. The original cast, including actor Michael J. Fox, posed for photos with their Broadway counterparts just outside the theater.
Following the performance, an action was held in support of Michael J. Fox Foundation, raising money for Parkinson's research. Back to the Future, the musical, debuted in London back in 2020 before coming to Broadway just last month.
You checked it out.
So much fun
Yeah.
as a kid of the 80s.
Yeah.
It is just so interesting to look at this play that looks at a kid looking back in the 80s at his parents' time in the 50s here
Yeah.
in the 2020s.
Because we're in the future that they were predicting. Guys, it didn't turn out the way you told us it would. But very cool show. All right, coming up in our next hour, Congress opens hearings on the possibility of UFOs. Why lawmakers say it's more about transparency than science fiction.
And we're watching Wall Street following the Federal Reserve's decision on interest rates and what it means for your family's finances.
And we will, of course, bring you the latest on the Hunter Biden plea deal drama unfolding in federal court right now. You're streaming CBS News.